Hi, everyone. Thank you for being patient with us. We have an international panel here. People have come from all over the world, and so they are now here, and they're going to tell you, share with you some of their expertise. But I'm going to start us off by just introducing a bit of the why of why we're here, and then we're going to talk about more of the how we can make progress in this particular area. So my name is Jonnie Penn. I'm based at the University of Cambridge. I study the history and philosophy of artificial intelligence. And the thing I want to do with you here is I want to begin with this photo, which is of Central Park. And the reason I share this image in talks like this is because I want to explore potential avenues for the future of artificial intelligence that are of benefit to more than just the kind of elite, who are the group that stand to benefit most from the future of AI. And the reason I like this as a metaphor is because there was a certain window of time in which Central Park could have been built. If that land had been developed today, it would be very difficult to go back and knock on those people's doors and suggest the idea of a 700-acre park in the middle of New York City, the most populous city in the United States. And so it's an example of something that, even though capitalism could have had its way with this land and we could have made a lot of money and had excellent kind of thrilling things there, we instead decided to go with a public good, something that was shareable, no matter how much money you made, that different people could enjoy. And the other interesting thing about the history of Central Park is that the idea for Central Park wasn't a bureaucrat, it wasn't a government worker, it was a poet, actually, that initially had the idea for designating this piece of land for the public good. His name's William Bryant. It's in the middle of the 19th century. And I think with artificial intelligence, when we talk about the future of AI and with data governance too, it's alienating for some people. So they don't necessarily feel like they can participate in crafting the sort of future that they want. And I want to just explore that a little bit before we start our panel. Basically, what I want to do is break down 3 misconceptions about data governance via our understanding of AI. An important step first is to just break from the idea that we have a strong way of predicting the future. These are postcards from the turn of the last century that were commissioned by an artist in France to imagine what the year 2000 would be like. And some of them, they did quite well. I mean, I look at this and think of like the hoverboards that your kids might have zooming around town. Or this isn't so different than maybe listening to an audiobook, except for the machine that churns the books into something you can listen to. I'm not entirely sure how that was supposed to work. They're really big into flying and drunk flying, apparently. You know, cops would have wings. You know, you would have flower fights or whatever the hell is happening here. And undersea travel was, you know, imagined, and also undersea croquet. And this image, there's about 90 images in all. This one sticks out for me as a good example of when we try to predict the future, things that we commonly do wrong. So this is a maid cleaning the house with a motorized broom. And you have to think, well, they wouldn't perhaps have imagined the idea of a vacuum cleaner, but a motorized broom seemed maybe the next logical step, given that, you know, automation had come into effect in certain areas and you had to clean the house, so why not just kind of automate the broom? And for me, it's a reminder that when we try and look into the future, especially if you're a business person, this is something that is true of business and, you know, civic life, you have to be sensitive to the fact that it's our values that drive these sort of technological changes. And so, you know, if we wanted the house clean and a vacuum cleaner would do it better than a motorized broom, then that's a good, you know, that's the decision, that's the way we will go. And so when we imagine the future now, I think it's important to return to our values, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit during our panel. So the second misconception I want to break down quickly is about the history of AI. When you think about artificial intelligence, many engineers, for example, might cite you know, Alan Turing or John von Neumann or Charles Babbage even as the kind of the kind of initial contributors to the history of computing. And while that is true, it's not actually entirely true. That image gives you kind of a very mathematical sense of where AI came from. So this is a team at the university, at Queen Mary University of London. This is a human being playing a really bad video game. And this is an algorithm playing the same game. This is my favorite GIF of the year. Because it just goes and goes and goes. And it can seem a bit like witchcraft when you see this, because you think, okay, well, it's doing something that I just don't understand. It's using mathematics that if you do not have an engineering background, or if you're not a PhD researcher in AI, you might not understand exactly how the hell it's doing this. And if you tie that sort of feeling with a history of AI and Turing and von Neumann, then you might think, well, there's no place for me in kind of the trajectory, the overall trajectory of AI. And actually, I don't think that's true. So this is a picture of taken in 1956 at the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence, which was the event that gave AI its name. I've actually been living with the family of the guy in the middle there and working with them in Boston, where I've been visiting researcher at MIT, trying to understand the history of what exactly the kind of key assumptions were that they were basing their research on back then. And the interesting thing for me, there's many interesting things. I'm not going to be able to go into all of them, but a few interesting things from this period are that, first of all, this was a publicly funded venture. It was, sorry, actually, that's not true. This was, I'm going to come to that in a sec. The important thing for this was that one of the fellows here that isn't pictured was a researcher named Herbert Simon, who you may know from the history of economics. He won a Nobel Prize in 1978. And Simon was credited with conceiving the first working prototype of artificial intelligence. And he did it, they were working at the Rand Corporation in Los Angeles, and they were stumbling and stumbling and stumbling, trying to make something work. And eventually what they did was use mathematics from Simon's background in management science. And basically, Simon appealed to the logic of how a corporation works to model how an artificial entity works, or could work. And that ended up being successful, and that gave us our kind of first breakthrough in the 20th century in the development of AI. But the interesting thing is, this history, this kind of origin in public administration has been written out of our popular understanding of where AI comes from. And the same is actually true in the history of computing generally. If you look at Charles Babbage was working on behalf of the government. He was building a tool for the government. And there's a great book by a historian of science named John Agar, who studied the origins of computing in public administration and showed basically that the British civil service were more influential in the development of early computing than almost anyone else, because they were the ones that commissioned the tools to bring about the sort of the adequate level of knowledge to initiate the digital computing program. And we don't think about that. We don't think about state control necessarily as where computing came from. And yet we are now, as we'll get into this panel, dealing with a lot of the consequences of technologies that enable control at levels that we are not often comfortable with. And so, just one quick quote here that Herbert Simon said about his version of, or his view of where AI came from. He said that, and computing generally, he said, physicists and electrical engineers had little to do with the invention of the digital computer. The real inventor was the economist Adam Smith. So again, the history of computing in economics and in state control, I don't think are fully appreciated. Instead, what we have is things like this, that we see the brain, and we have appeal to kind of scientific authority that is, yes, a contributing factor to AI, but maybe not the sole contributing factor. So to round this out, another third kind of misconception I want to break is that AI exists in a political vacuum. And it's easy when we're talking about the exciting avenues that AI could go down to think that the future will be rosy, and of course that is not entirely true. AI exists within a political landscape that is, somewhat troubling. We have currently 1%, the richest 1% of the world are on course to control 2/3 of the world's wealth by 2030. If you look at the last industrial revolution, the top 10 industrialized nations gained 50 times, an average income of 50 times higher than the lowest industrialized 10. So income inequality is already a problem. Tools like AI are going to exacerbate that problem. So we need to have a conversation about what avenues we can find to redistribute wealth in a way that is sustainable. So given that there's a lot at stake, there's a lot of potential shared reward, but there's also a lot of shared risk. We've convened this session to bring together different thinkers from both Harvard University and groups here in the UK, including the firm that's suing Cambridge Analytica and a researcher from UCL who deals, they all collectively deal at the intersection of technology and law. And so I'd like to bring them up on stage now and have a round of applause for our speakers, or our panelists. We have one more panelist coming from, who may join us halfway through this session. If you have Slido on your phone, I'm going to be checking in on Slido if you have any questions during this panel. To begin, I would love if each of the researchers, if you guys would each introduce yourselves, perhaps starting.
I had a number I was trying to find where the number was.
Oh, yeah. We choreographed a dance for you guys. Ravi, do you want to start us off?
Hi, yeah, I will do. Hi there all. Thanks for Jonnie for the introduction and CogX for inviting me to this conference. By way of background, I'm a solicitor and a partner at ITN Solicitors. I'm primarily a data rights practitioner, which is why I'm here today. And specifically in relation to the issues we're discussing here, I'm instructed on the lead claim against Cambridge Analytica, which is a company that I'm sure needs no introduction to the people in this room. I'm acting on behalf of a US citizen, Professor David Carroll, and this is at the moment, a claim and a complaint to the Information Commissioner to seek disclosure of the information held about my client, but also, probably more importantly, what was done with that information and who was it given to, and to try to work out, in effect, whether that information was weaponized as an electoral tool. Now, that has led to the Information Commissioner issuing what's called an enforcement notice against the company, demanding disclosure of that information. And as that claim and that Information Commissioner enforcement notice is ongoing, there is naturally a limit to what I can say because it's ongoing litigation. But I'd be happy to try and discuss this as we move forward and the wider implications of what that type of practice means.
You said you were going to share everything with us.
See how far we get into the discussion. But the case also illustrates a few wider issues, and two wider issues that I think I'd like to talk about today and reflect in the title of this discussion today, which is about data governance. There's two real ways to look at this title. We're talking about the way to either govern data itself, or also the way that data affects governance. And that dual-facing aspect of the title is really illustrated by what happens in this case. So firstly, there's the power of data rights to affect real change. And that's through individuals claiming a stake in determining for themselves how their personal information is used. And that framework is premised on the idea of fundamental rights applying to data rights. And this is not to question the importance of technological changes or innovation. As we all know from what's happened today, the digital revolution and data has given us tremendous benefits. Rather, we just need to be vigilant about the way that data is used. And as the Information Commissioner has said, to make sure that people's fundamental rights are not sacrificed in the name of innovation. And I'd go further, actually. I would say it's really important that rights is part of the design of technology. And there are real tangible examples of that in practice. For example, IBM's Watson have a real focus on transparency and giving meaningful access to people that use the platform so they understand how it's being used. In contrast, Cambridge Analytica took a very different approach to personal rights, saying, and I quote, "My client was no more entitled to make a subject access request than a member of the Taliban sitting in a cave in the remotest corner of Afghanistan." Now, that was wrong as a matter of law. But when they were told that that was wrong as a matter of law by the Information Commissioner, their response was, "We do not expect to be further harassed with this sort of correspondence." That's not quite in the spirit of open and transparent accountability of data use that maybe IBM Watson shows, and ended up resulting in an enforcement notice, which again shows the power of data rights in action. Secondly, about the effect of data on governance. There's a real growing concern about the use of personal data and how it may be shared in the political platform. My work has started to illustrate that there really is an increasing interest in how behavioral advertising can be used within politics. I was recently doing a talk in Parliament about this very subject. And the Information Commissioner herself has said this is a bit of a problem, saying that she's deeply concerned that what's happening is happening without due legal or ethical consideration of the impacts of technology on our democratic system. And despite that growing interest, the space is often misunderstood. So it's really important for those at the forefront of technology and those at the forefront of law and ethics to come together. So I'm really happy to be part of this dialogue and ensure that we can all foster greater understanding of what we do and how we can help each other.
Yes, so I'm going to try and dig in with you guys to some plain language ideas of how we describe these very complicated things. Not that the public doesn't understand, but in ways that aren't deceptive or that are trying to empower their understanding of the power dynamics involved. Michael, do you want to first introduce yourself, and then I'm going to go through each person, introduce your work and what you're interested in?
Yeah, so you just want me to do a short introduction then?
Please, if you would.
So, yeah, I'm Mike. I'm Michael Veale. I'm a doctoral researcher at University College London. I work in the intersection of really machine learning and data protection law, privacy-enhancing technologies and data protection law, and I also look a lot at the use of machine learning and data-driven technologies inside government today, issues of fairness, accountability, and bias.
Great. Salome.
I'm Salome. Apologies, I'm getting over a cold. I'm Salome Viljoen. I'm a fellow focused on privacy and cybersecurity issues at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. I have a law background, and I sort of wear two hats at Berkman, I would say. One is sort of working on privacy and cybersecurity law, and in those spaces I think a lot about how structural concentrations of informational power may affect the range of political possibilities, affordances that we can use to develop better privacy or better cybersecurity. And then I also am very active in an ethical tech group where we focus a lot on what ethical production of technology may look like, and a lot of the conversations focus a lot on who we would need to bring to the table and make meaningful stakeholders in deciding what ethical production of technology would look like. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. Keith?
My name is Keith Porcaro. I'm also a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center. I'm an American-trained lawyer and a technologist. My work focuses on the development of legal norms in a digital society, and what that means is sort of two things. One is how can we use existing structures of law to cope with relationships that are increasingly digital, and then the second is how can we kind of help people develop informal understandings of complex systems, which is a fancy way of saying, how do you explain this stuff to people without asking them to be lawyers or technologists? And I also work on a project called Digital Public, which is focused on thinking about data trusts as a way to help govern public interest technology projects.
Do you want to explain what a data trust is? Has anybody heard that expression before? Show of hands, data trust? Okay. Do you want to explain what a data trust is?
Sure. What's the easiest way to explain this? Okay, so in law, in common law, there's a concept called a fiduciary.
I've got to stop you. It doesn't have to be the full.
Okay, right, yes. No, this will be 4 sentences.
Okay, great.
Okay, so there's a concept called a fiduciary, which is basically a fiduciary is a person who can manage something on behalf of somebody else, right? And so a trust is essentially a way to create something that looks like a fiduciary relationship. So I can take care of a thing, a piece of land, some money, code or data on behalf of a beneficiary, a community. And so a data trust is essentially trying to apply that framework to digital assets, to code and to data. So it's an interesting way to think about what duties we have toward code or a data set, and to whom do we owe those duties.
And do you want to explain a bit of where this idea came from? Oh, Stephanie's joined us. Great.
Uh-huh.
Please welcome to stage Stephanie, our final speaker. This is fantastic. I didn't mention in my initial talk, but I had wanted to mention the importance of diversity. And when it was initially an all-male panel, we said we just can't start yet. So thank you, Stephanie, for joining us. Would you give us a quick introduction to your work, and then we're gonna dig into this further.
Yes. Good morning. I'm very sorry about arriving a little bit late. I'm very happy to be here, and my research background in terms of relevance for this panel and hopefully this crowd is in data protection, privacy, civil liberties, and human rights. So I've published a paper looking at how US technology companies have been battling with sovereign states, so countries, over data protection. And I was looking specifically at some case studies like Facebook, Google, and I published this a few years ago before the Cambridge Analytica story came out. So I tried to apply my international relations political risk background with my background as a technologist, because I think that technology is probably one of the biggest political risk factors that we're going to be contending with, basically, for the 21st century. So looking forward to hearing thoughts from this crowd.
Great,
in this
thank
panel.
you, Stephanie. Okay, so I'm going to go back to you, Keith, just for a second. I'm curious to know, can you explain the relationship between a land trust? Who's heard of a land trust here? Hand side, please, I can't see it. Okay, so more people are familiar with the idea of a land trust.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand the balance, the similarities between those two?
Sure. So in the US, actually, a land trust is not strictly speaking a trust in some jurisdictions. So it's, but they use something called the conservation easement. But it's based on a similar sort of structure, which is to say that there is some third party responsible for ensuring that a piece of land isn't developed on or isn't built on, no matter sort of who the actual owner of that piece of land is. And the sort of origins of trust law date, morbidly enough, all the way back to the Crusades, where here people would go off and fight, and they needed to leave their land and property in the care of somebody else without actually sort of giving it to them, so hence sort of trustees. But I think that the sort of philosophy behind land trusts, the idea that we could keep an asset in trust and restrict what kind of economic development can be done on it and restrict sort of the purposes for which it can be used is something that I think has inspired people to look at a similar model for data, especially as we're starting to think about not only what we should be using it for, but what uses we should be trying to prevent or limit.
Great, thank you. So, Salome, would you tell us a bit about, I've called it in the past intelligence inequality, which is, we're familiar with income inequality, and now we're entering a world where some organizations have far more access and control and can benefit from data more than others. Would you tell us a bit about your view of the power dynamics of how things stand currently?
Yeah, I mean, to keep it short and simple, I think that you're starting to see a handful of companies, predominantly American companies, and you all know which companies I'm talking about. I'm talking about Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, also kind of to some extent, who hold such an enormous amount of information about us that you are starting to, I think, starting to see what I call a structural advantage in informational power. And law is good, well, more or less good at understanding structural market power when it's economic power. And so I think strategically you can sort of do two forms of translation here. You can start to think about how structural informational power starts to translate into structural economic power. So how Amazon maybe can use all the information they have about you to make really fine-grained decisions about vertical integration or how they're going to price products or how they may recommend products to you to sort of keep you on Amazon. But I also think, and maybe more interestingly, that you start to see long-term effects on how technology is developed, what sorts of future uses of the information about us are going to be deployed. Those decisions are being made by a handful of companies that hold a structural advantage in that type of informational power. And what does that mean for democracies that believe in a marketplace of ideas and a marketplace of opportunity? Yeah, I'll sort of leave it at that.
Thank you.
Short provocation right now.
So Michael, and I might ask you in a sec, Ravi, as well. You guys are based in the UK. What can you tell us? You're working on the GDPR constantly. What can you tell us about your view of the power dynamics here and how it might relate to people starting businesses or running businesses in the UK?
Yeah. So many of you will have heard of the GDPR. It is a law which is a general evolution. A lot of people see it as like a revolution. It's a big change. It's actually a general evolution. Many of the provisions were still there in the 1995 directive. Many of them come from, say, French law in the late 1970s, say around algorithmic decision making. all come from 1970s law, really. So it's part of a longer intellectual evolution. And one of the things it strengthens are individual data rights. And it's not giving individuals a huge number of new rights, it's enabling them to make them in new ways, electronically, freely, and so on. However, a struggle that's always happened in data governance has been individualization of issues. Putting the burden on the user to understand a pretty complex ecosystem, which, like was said, is also full of very structural weirdness, which can be really hard to grapple with and to deal with. And also to act on it, to have the time, energy, even when data is being collected about you. So for example, I wouldn't be surprised if there were Wi-Fi tracking set up in this entire building based on the free hotspots to understand footfall. Technically, that would be personal data. You may have rights over it, but how would you know to access it? So one thing that we've been doing is we're looking into how you can automate data rights and also turn an individual burden into something that can be collectively used to investigate and to change bigger market systems. So there are provisions in the GDPR and other laws that are developing in this regard around that link to competition, that link to structural power, the link to organizations having to think in advance before they do something and have justification to society rather than to individuals. But we do need to go more in that direction. And if we focus too much on individual rights, it's going to be tough to get those to be used to the volume and against pretty arcane, quick-moving, difficult-to-understand systems. And getting used to an effectiveness that can really provoke change. We've got some great work from Ravi and other people doing targeted cases in high-profile areas, but it doesn't stop SMEs, small companies, abusing data on a large scale. And if that data leaks, it contains really sensitive stuff.
Thank you. So this makes me think that when we talk about data in the circles I've been in, people struggle to find the right metaphor, right? We could talk about it like oil, the next oil or the next gold. You might have heard these expressions. And if that's the metaphor we're working with, then it seems to be that we are legitimizing a culture in which if you extract it, you own it. And that's going to benefit the power structure, the kind of companies that are in power currently. Other ways we could talk about it are, and I want to explore this with you guys, but intellectual property, which maybe you own for a certain amount of time and then it falls into the public interest. Or we could talk about data like people, and we've decided that you can't own people. And I'm not the expert on this so much as you guys are, so I want to explore what metaphors you guys turn to, because the reason this was titled a kind of bold vision for the future is because it seems to necessitate us to renegotiate our collective agreements, right? To figure out what the benefit is of having individualized risk versus collective risk and shared benefit, shared reward. What do you think, Ravi?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the metaphor I'd like to use to explain the structure, I think the closest, the most appropriate is probably fast food, because it's something that comes from sustenance, it comes from something we need, and the idea that actually you need to control the parameters of it, and actually sugar and the fats and understanding the extremities of the content. If you're thinking about data rights will always subsist. I think a lot of what we're talking about here is the idea of ownership, and data as oil doesn't really capture the idea that individuals will always have rights over their data. Data rights will never cede through shifting ownership. So I think while you've got all these different conceptions of how you can protect data in a broader sense, and ownership particularly, I think what we need to be very, very cognizant of is data rights never giving way through either innovation or ownership or, for example, intellectual property. I think one of the reasons intellectual property is quite a good metaphor is because companies are very good at protecting their own intellectual property. And if individuals start to empower themselves in the same way to protect their own rights, intellectual property is just a right, then we'll start to see a sea change. And I think going back to what Michael was saying before about this, it's been quite intangible data rights, and it's quite difficult for individuals to try to enforce them. I think what you need is not so much a change in the law, but a cultural shift. And I think what you can see from the GDPR is not so much that the GDPR came in, but it came in at the time of a media storm around data misuse. And if you want to know if individuals are interested in data rights, you can look at my inbox for how many consent emails I've had, but also how many new inquiries I've had. Because I think this media storm has changed people's idea of actually what does data misuse mean. And we see it also now with the Facebook litigation from the data spill. I think we're going to see a change, and that will hopefully snowball and mushroom in to a wider evolution.
So some of these issues are exacerbated by the fact that we're not just solving them domestically, but that we're dealing with this, having to harmonize international disharmony. Stephanie, what is your opinion of how we can potentially, or what are you seeing as the key challenges around the international problem?
One of the things that I've been looking at is what we can learn from different countries about how data is being gathered. And I think data can often feel really nebulous. What do we mean by that? So I would love to give an example that's really concrete that we can all understand and hopefully get equally horrified by, which is biometrics, right? So this country has a long-delayed government biometrics strategy. It's supposed to be being published this month. We've been waiting for it for 5 years. But this country has been gathering people's biometrics by stealth. So we're talking about your facial recognition points, which police have been gathering and trialing at different points throughout the United Kingdom. You may hear from my accent that I was not born here. Any of us who are foreign or EU nationals and having to be getting on the Brexit app to get processed will be handing over our fingerprints, retinal scans. These are being done at the UK borders. It's also being done when you go to an airport like Dubai. So you'll walk through a tunnel that's designed to look like an aquarium. It's really fun, right? So walk through and look at all the fish. And what they're doing for the 20 seconds that you walk through is getting all the points on your face and your retinal scan. And then if you look over in India, they've built the Hare system, which was supposed to have been voluntary. And it sounds great. It's really wonderful. It gives people a digital identity, people who didn't have one before. Maybe they were poor, maybe they were from a caste that didn't have it. And it sounds wonderful as well because it helps to combat a very real problem, which is fraud, right? So you want to make sure that the money that's going to a certain person is going to the right person. And we also see the same technology being used at the United Nations on refugees on a scheme called ID 2020. Again, great, these people don't have the paperwork, they've had to flee their homes, they're in terrible circumstances, and we want to make sure the money goes to the right people to feed and clothe them every month. But they're having their biometric data taken, they have no right to fight back. We don't know how it's stored, we know it's hackable. The Hare system in India has been hacked several times. You can buy people's biometric data online, right? So I've worked in cybersecurity, and biometrics on the one hand sounds great, and it's really convenient. You go to the Singapore airport, and it's wonderful. You just walk right through. They just scan your face. Who wants to stand in line? I've got an iPhone. I did it as well. I put my thumbprint in. It's great. I don't have to type a code every time. And right now, that's stored on the device, so it's fine. But there's an entire conversation that's happening globally and at different levels. So India's Supreme Court has said that that Hare system is actually against the law. You can't compel people to hand over their body data. But we know people have been doing it for fun and for free on Ancestry.com. Hey, let's have our DNA checked. Let's see where my family's from. That sounds great. That just got hacked. And no one is being held accountable for these hacks. So Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, Equifax, 145 million Americans' data taken. Has anyone seen anyone do jail time for that or be held accountable in any way, shape, or form? Some executives did a little dance before Congress. Some of them left with really nice golden parachutes, and they're playing golf right now. Yet they want to have all of our data, and that's our most private data. You can reset your username. You can reset your password. You cannot reset your retina scan. Right? So I think we need to really look at this issue of data consent and transparency. And frankly, it reminds me a little bit of the Me Too movement, right? So we're talking about gender and diversity. Tech companies seem to think that it's fine to just take people's data and keep it. And we're seeing governments saying the same thing. Again, in this country, with the biometrics data, they don't have to get rid of your data if you were in police custody and then released, having been found innocent. You have to ask for it to be deleted, okay? The courts rejected that decision, but the Home Office decided to pardon itself. Right? So like, I'm kind of here today to help like wake all of us up, because with each thing that I have seen, I'm like, oh my God, why are we building this? If I go through Dubai airport and all my data's taken, where is that stored? What rights do I have as an American and British citizen to ask the government there, I'm sorry, are you keeping my biometric data safe, Dubai? Right? Like, how is this working? And I guarantee you, no tech company is thinking about this. They're just like, super, we just want a really nice multi-million-dollar contract to build a biometrics data system to help process people in the airports. They see this as like a supply chain technical problem. They don't see it as a cybersecurity problem. They definitely don't care about it as a privacy, human rights, civil liberties problem. And then, well, I'll just go GDPR, it's great, but like, the only thing that governments and companies respect is money. So until somebody is punished for this, and I'm talking punished painfully, cash, board members actually held to account, maybe have to go on trial, maybe a company is sued out of business, my concern is that this is all just going to be built by stealth. The UK government might punt their biometric strategy another year. Why not? Who's holding them to account? So I hope all of you will.
So Theresa May said at Davos this year that AI was going to be the world leader in ethics. The world leader in the ethics of AI. We've got some laughter at the front here. given that we are it seems that we're in a race to the bottom globally in terms of like all these new opportunities, and if they're not going to hold back, why would I hold back? And if these big companies aren't going to respect the law, why am I as a small business owner, why do I have to kind of hamstring myself when I'm just trying to start off and create a value to my community? Michael, what do you think? How do we balance the kind of disharmony between these different contexts?
I think firstly, for empowering small businesses, you have to have a lot of platforms, technological systems that just are modular, that build these in by default. This is the idea of privacy by design, data protection by design, and so on, that makes it easier to obey rights than not to obey them. And I think that's a sort of prerequisite. But one of the things that worries me about large companies is we focus a lot on this paradigm of people collect a lot of, or these organizations collect a lot of data about us, and we've got some rights, we're getting over them, and these companies aren't giving it to us, or they are giving it to us into limited form or so on. But they'll have to give it more over time. And I don't think that's completely right. I think we're looking at slightly a wrong trajectory here. So an example I use here is a case that we've currently got on complaint with the Irish Data Protection Commissioner about Apple. So Apple tend to sell themselves as a very privacy-preserving company where they don't really collect people's data. It's not in their advertising business model. But they also don't give you control over the data that they have about you. So who uses Siri? Who has used it at all ever? So if you use Siri, Siri transcription all happens on the cloud. Siri transcription happens remotely. Your messages are transcribed, your dictations are transcribed, the voice recording is stored. Apple, if you write to them, they store this data, they admit they store it, they do not give you access to this data. They refuse to honor any requests to have that data, to have a copy of that data, which is really against the law. And how they do this is by trying to use privacy-enhancing technologies to make it very difficult to find yourself in their data set. So they've got a system where they can deliver you a personalized service, but going the other way around, they've decided not to make it easy for you to say, this was my device, there I am in the data set. And this is increasingly possible with a whole range of technologies. So companies hold huge volumes of highly sensitive message and audio data, for example, which, if it was leaked, would be trivial to re-identify. I just look at your voice print. I look at where you were or who you messaged on a certain day. I just search it for anyone's mention of a name. This is a hugely easy to re-identify data set that companies are deliberately not making the effort to provide you with rights over, because it's useful for them to keep it in a form which is very difficult to have any autonomy at all. So this is a world where we target people without really knowing their names. And I think that's where we're going, and that's how companies are currently seeing the way in which they can go around data protection law as the next big step to avoiding honoring people's rights while keeping huge data mountains and lakes.
So I think we could spend a lot of time talking about the negative possibilities here. And I'm sure in the papers you guys have read enough about some of the horrible things. And I think it's also worthwhile that we continue to share them when they happen. But I also, since I have you guys here, I want to start talking about, to the title of this session, potentially bold steps that we could take. And I'll give you guys an example. I was going to share it in my talk, but I cut it for time. In 1955, when that group that I showed you applied for the money to fund the first conference on artificial intelligence, they were told, this is not a very good idea. We're not going to give you full funding. We're going to give you half funding because it's just too crazy to work. And yet here we are today at primarily an artificial intelligence conference because we've invested time and a tremendous amount of resources into making it work. And so I wonder, Salome and then Keith, what do you guys think are kind of viable pathways that we collectively can start to address some of these larger problems?
Sure, so I'll start. To take it back to the question you asked previously about useful metaphors, I think law proceeds by analogy and precedent. So I think a lot about what are useful analogies and what are useful precedents for how we can start to wrap our heads around the incredibly complex and overwhelming problem of data and how to govern it ethically and how to make sure it's not being used for horrific ends. And I sort of have two analogies that I find helpful, and I'll focus on one, which is the environmental protection example or sort of metaphor. In the US in the 1960s, the country was incredibly dirty. I mean, Los Angeles was just coated in smog. You had rivers that were on fire, and it seemed like a pretty insurmountable...
You mean literally on...
Actual rivers actually on fire because of how dirty they were. You had Silent Spring came out, just decimation of birds and insect populations. And these seemed like a lot of loosely related but very difficult to tackle in sort of individual face these sorts of problems. By their definition, they were collective, they were dispersed, and they seemed overwhelming. And the solution that we had in the US, which is limited, but I think by and large successful, was to have an environmental protection approach. And so you have an agency. And some of what that agency does is just hardline outlaw certain types of pollutive activities, hardline outlaw certain types of highly toxic substances. Other things that they do is encourage, in sort of a privacy by design way, low emission production, sort of low water use products. And so you sort of have like a environmentally friendly economic incentive model being used. You have just certain stuff is completely outlawed model. You have just baseline regulations. So if you're producing a dangerous toxic substance like oil, you have to have a lot of just built-in regulatory stopgaps around that. So you have highly detailed regulation about what is your secondary spill mechanism, and someone goes in and checks that every 30 days. And you have that sort of security built-in day-to-day, 1,001 checkpoints sort of stuff also coming out of that type of model. So I think the holistic approach of an environmental protection model is very useful at getting at the very disparate levels in which this stuff happens and the lot of different sort of solutions that people are throwing out there and how to sort of create a cohesive framework around those solutions.
Great, thanks.
With
Keith,
that.
Yeah,
what do you think?
to piggyback on this with yet another metaphor, I think that it might be helpful to think about data as uranium rather than oil. Right, like, and so there's sort of two frames to that. One is, there's a sort of a great potential to produce lots of things that we weren't able to do before. And the second is that nuclear waste is really hazardous, right? And like there's this enormous potential for harm if we are irresponsible about it. And so at the beginning of the nuclear age, this idea that we can use uranium for everything worked, and then eventually we realized that it made people sick, and that wasn't as good. And then to run on Salome's point, there's an area in law where if you're dealing with nuclear waste, the sort of regime is looking at like ultra hazardous materials, which essentially says if something happens, if you spill it while you're transporting it, we don't care how responsible you are. It doesn't matter how improbable the accident was, you're liable and you're paying. And so I think that it does a couple of things. One is that in this context, we're trying to reconsider sort of what duties we all have to each other about data or about AI or about kind of anything that's sensitive that we're holding. And right now, I think as sort of Jonnie put it in the question, people are thinking about using these data sets to create value, right? And that's the sort of first foot forward. And then so when we're talking about rights-based approaches, we're talking about sort of restraining value. And I think that in order for us to move forward, we need to sort of flip that around, right? We need to think about like what we're actually sort of valuing and what we actually decide that we want to create in the world. And then the second thing I think is that we kind of as individuals, as people who are transacting our data, need to kind of be better equipped to kind of make those transactions with a kind of a more, I guess, assertive approach. In the same way that sort of now it's difficult to get a nuclear power plant built in your neighborhood. People need to kind of be educated to kind of have that same skepticism about the transactions that they're making with their data. So it's duties, it's regulation on the one hand, it's a rights-based approach, but I don't think that we kind of yet have the capability to assert those rights, especially if we're not technology experts or legal experts, or there's sort of a big case like Cambridge Analytica to run it down.
So what I find with my friends who research in this area, sometimes it's hard to prove material harm. As opposed to a river being on fire or uranium, you can see someone lose their life or an environment, damaged. But it's hard to find the examples sometimes. And one example I was told recently, I don't know if this is true, but ambulance drivers in London will use Google Maps as opposed to GPS or government data address records from the UK government. And as a result, Google Maps, as you know, sometimes doesn't know exactly how to get you to some places. And people have died as a result of these ambulance drivers relying on a private technology as opposed to government records of where every house is. Do you find, Ravi, you've been responsive to like a rights-based approach. How do you think we show the harm and contain the harm and not overdo it and kind of and restrict businesses, say, too much?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that encapsulated in that quote from the Information Commissioner I gave at the start, how to make sure rights don't get in the way of innovation or the other way around. Well, I think the way to start and the way to consider the issue is, well, what's the mischief that the rights-based approach should try to contain? What's the mischief that we're trying to stop? Now, the way the data protection regime works is not to try to stop the end result of the technology, but to give individuals rights over their data. I think that's a really clever way of making sure that you contain an issue which otherwise could be quite gaseous, quite flexible and hard to contain. Is actually, if you flip it on its head and say, actually, we deal with the individual data that is affected, and you allow individuals to assert their own rights over the way that is ultimately used. And I think that idea of trying to contain the mischief through asserting individual rights is quite powerful.
Michael, what do you think about the trade-offs involved? Because in some cases you're going to be, it's a spectrum, right? You have to be giving up privacy and to be able to use a particular service. How do you approach
Yeah, so I think there's a few things on that. One of them is that there are a lot, and there were some talks yesterday about this, of technologies that let you do much more with, or the same with less data. So really, I'm always shocked at how behind industry is on technology in this space. A huge range of technologies that allow you to run a lot of programming, a lot of training of models, for example, machine learning models, locally on your device in a distributed way, don't build up central stores of data, and yet still deliver the same product. So firstly, there's a long way to go before we get to the point where we're actually seeing those trade-offs. There's a lot more that we can do. But secondly, there are times, especially for high-dimensional data, location data and other types of data, where you can't anonymize it. Anonymization is just out, just not an option without destroying all of the value in it. So what do you want to do? Well, we might want to get some societal value from that data. You can functionally anonymize this data by putting it in a space where you are controlling access to it, you're controlling the kind of analysis that people are doing on it, and this is what statistical offices have done for a long time, enabling microdata access to censuses or other surveys to accredited researchers or companies who would come in, do only certain types of analysis, that would all be checked what they were doing, they'd be checked what they took out. And I think we could really go for a model that looks a bit more like that in the future. And I think we've got a lot of opportunities to build that. For example, public libraries. What is the library of the future? Well, it also needs to be a space for people to learn about what's really happening with their data, to have some agency over what's going on, to enter into a dialogue, a public fora, where they can have that discussion. Equally, technologies such as liquid or delegative democracy could be really useful here. So I think there's a real burden on rights. I think rights are a very, very powerful tool, but we cannot expect them to make the ecosystem healthier as a whole, because we cannot expect them to be used in really arcane and weird situations. They're an important part of the toolkit. They cannot be the only part. We need to be able to delegate rights to people who can understand how to apply them in new and weird and arcane circumstances. So liquid democracy is all about delegating your rights or votes. So if I don't know much about healthcare, I might delegate it to somebody who does. And as a result, when there's a vote coming up on a health issue, that person can vote for me. But I can always also pull that vote back at any time and vote in the way I wanted to. But it allows you to specialize. And I think we could go for a system that's more like that, where we can help people really remove the burden from their lives of micromanaging these huge data flows everywhere, but still have agency and autonomy, especially in the times that they want it and find it important.
I hope that ambulance is using the right GPS to get to wherever they're going.
Yeah, the Google Maps has gone wrong, right?
All right, so what I'm going to pull out of what you're saying, and just a reminder to the audience, if you go to slide.io, yeah, that's it, and put in hashtag CogX18, you want to ask questions of the panelists, or you can do the old-fashioned way and put your hand up. I'm happy to take them. What I take out of what you've just said is that potentially we need to start moving away from the notion of ownership towards access and control. So I see you nodding there. Do you want to?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time around this idea of the property analogy or ownership analogy, and
They're lost. That's what I'm saying.
I
hope
think
someone's okay.
A bit to Michael's point of being surprised that companies haven't used these sort of data-efficient technologies, that they're being underutilized. I'm not really that surprised, because data is incredibly cheap for them to collect, and all of the benefits from data accrue to them, while all of the risks of that data being either hacked or a privacy violation occurring lies with us. So they get all of the benefit while none of the risk. It's an incredibly cheap resource for them to use. And so it's like, if you have free labor, you'll just continue to have labor and you won't innovate a way towards automation. It's sort of the same basic principle. I know you know that.
I agree with your point on incentives, definitely.
Yes. But sort of by the same vein, I think rights are an incredibly important aspect of this toolkit, and I'm still very much in a yes and moment in sort of thinking about what tools to bring to bear to this issue. But particularly in the US context, when it starts being emerged, should we think of this as a property right? Should I think of this as my data that I own? Is that the solution to a justice issue or an inequality issue? And I think there are sort of two critiques there. One is just functionally, I'm not sure what my data is. So when Google sees that I had a conversation with someone about poodles, and I'm near my friend Nikki, and we're having a conversation about poodles, and then when I go in, dogs near me, and it autofills, and it shows me pictures of poodles, whose data is that? And I mean, in the biometric data, if you're leaking biometric data and it is being used by an insurance company to now charge your child, who has a high likelihood of cancer, an incredibly high insurance rate, where's the harm? Whose harm is there? Where is that data property right falling down onto like a particular kind of harm? So I think just in terms of conceptually, I'm not sure what private ownership of data looks like. And then on a deeper level, on a justice-based level, historically in the US, when we have responded to an power inequality problem or a justice problem by assigning someone a property right, it just never has worked historically. So there are horrible, infamous examples from US history. So 40 acres and a mule after we emancipated the slaves. I don't think that we would look back and say that was a great solution to an injustice problem or an unequal distribution of power. Reservations being given as private property to Indian and Native American tribes as we colonized the West. That was not a justice solution. I just don't think historically in the law that is a good way to achieve long-term, holistic, transformative change.
Stephanie,
So that's pretty negative. Someone could give it like a more positive example.
No, I think I'm happy to have a balance. You've wanted to respond, and then Stephanie, I want to ask you about your historical insight here, given your background. But
one thing on the idea of delegating rights. I think I can understand that position, but I think if you look at where the GDPR has actually sought to plug that gap by giving public interest groups the right to bring cases on behalf of individuals.
But not access to rights or so on.
But I think, well, I don't know if that's quite right.
82 doesn't have access rights in.
Well, that's a different discussion. But actually, the idea is it's an evolving, like you say, it's not a revolution of a law, it's an evolution. So 82, we haven't brought it into the UK. So that's a flaw that we have, but there's steps that we can take without having to delegate. It's more about empowering the rights. And then just on the environmental comparison, that's a really good comparison. I think one of the other things that comes out of that is we need an international response to environmental issues. We also need an international response to data abuses. And one of the big problems we have is we have a really divergent regime across the globe. So Europe's there's quite strong protection, America has quite low and ad hoc protections, and it allows an easy escape for companies or data abusers. You end up with data piracy effectively getting in place. So I think it's a really good example and something for us to build on, trying to internationalize the response.
Absolutely.
So Stephanie, before I turn it to you, one of the points I tried to make in the introduction is that because it's hard to predict exactly where things will go, there are many different actors, it's a complex system, it's it's problem stacked upon problem. What we ought to begin with, in my mind, and what I hear from other people, is that we have to return to our values. And Stephanie, I'm curious to hear from you. In my work historically, you've got a PhD in French history, and I want to know. In my work, historically, I find that because AI is rooted in the history of administration, it makes sense to me that we're moving towards a kind of increasingly bureaucratic world. And you hear things like hunters and gatherers worked 4 hours a day. Well, if a hunter and gatherer scrape their knee, they might die. So we've got some trade-offs. But we could enter a future where managing these sort of problems just takes up all of the sort of time that we might have once enjoyed life with. What's your perspective historically on where this might go in the long term?
I mean, it just gives me a massive migraine. So I've just left, I'm now independent, so I'm going to be really judicious in how I say this. I've been working with technology companies for 3 years because what technology companies need is a French historian by training. The first point that I would say in the discussion we're having here, which is about rights, and it's in some ways theoretical and important because we need to get those foundations right first. If you want to watch a horror movie, watch the Financial Times and just look at all the companies that are leaking data. I've been in the meetings where people are like, we don't even know what data we have. So we don't even know how to protect it. And once we know that we've been breached, that breach probably happened on average 180 days ago. We don't know what they took. Help. And like, that's the reality. So I'm loving that we're having this discussion, but I just want to also sort of add as a sort of counterweight, what's happening on the ground is terrifying. Companies do not know. So don't think that in every single room in America and Europe, thanks to the GDPR, et cetera, that they're all like on it. They are not on it. It is a massive dumpster fire, which is why I really encourage you to think about how you would like to have your data used, and you need to take ownership. Don't think someone else is like solving this. They're not. In terms of unintended consequences of systems that we build, this is where my background as a historian has fueled this decision to work in technology. I interviewed a French civil servant at the end of his life who had collaborated with the Nazis. And he had been involved in the arrest and internment and deportation of Jews who were sent to Auschwitz. And at the end of his life, as an elderly man, France put him on trial for crimes against humanity. And I was a young student and extremely impressionable and just watched this like, sort of 6 months, the longest trial in French legal history. And he explained how they did it. And what was really fascinating, and I mean that in a sort of horrific, I can't believe this is real sense, was that the reason France was able to hand over 76,000 Jews, fewer than 3% of whom returned at the end of the war, was that they had a perfect data set. But that data set hadn't been gathered with the intention of identifying France's Jews. France had built this data set in the 1920s and 30s. They had the most sophisticated police surveillance apparatus in the world at the time, and they built it because they wanted to keep track of their Muslim population because they had an empire, just like we had here in Britain, right? They had their biggest colonies were in French North Africa. So one of the columns, if you will, in their database was religion. So they were only interested in tracking the Muslim population, just to sort of keep track of the colonies and who was coming in and out of France. But they got everybody. But in 1940, the Germans invaded, France surrendered, and a new paymaster was in town. So you had the Vichy state, which was collaborating, and the Nazis. And people always think the Nazis asked for the data first. No. The Vichy state was like, can we help you get rid of this problem that we've decided we have? So now you had two political masters of an occupied country going around rounding people up. And it was French police. They knew exactly where everybody lived. They knew where all the students were. They knew where all the Jewish-owned businesses were, which they nationalized. They stole all the property. And they sent everybody away. And most of them didn't come back. And understanding that this technology, because it was paper-based technology, but it quickly became automated because it was then repurposed after World War II and used by the French for the Algerian War, because Algeria was part of France at the time, just like Alaska is part of the United States, right? It was absolutely as much a part of France as Provence. And they continued to keep this data, and they got into biometrics because they were interested in the types of ethnic tribes within Algeria. And they used this to round people up, intern them, torture them, and summarily execute them. So data for me is not just about money. It's not oil. It's not abstract. Data for me is about people and lives. And I have spent years studying what happened when a democracy, for very legitimate reasons of wanting to understand population control, I get it. Civil servants and administrators have a really tough job. I come from the States. We have 330 million people we're trying to keep track of. It's a mess, right? Here in Britain, it's 60 million. People need to have schools and all sorts of things. You know, these are people. This is the thing. It's good intentions. These are good people working on things, and they will build a system, but you have to build these systems always thinking, how could this go wrong? I did one civic technology project in this country for a British city, and I would terrify the engineers that I worked with, saying we have to build this system and ask ourselves what would happen if a fascist government took over Britain. And I gave them a little summary with presentation and slides to terrify them. And for 9 months, we built it that way. And within 48 hours, I had already found ways that we could have abused it, and it would have been terrifying if that had happened. So this is what I'm just trying to say. We have historical precedent of what happens when data is abused. I'm from the United States. We have a department called ICE that's rounding people up right now, separating children from parents, putting those kids in cages. Those are civil servants doing that. Who built the data?
Thank you very much. I appreciate those comments. I'm finding online in the slide.io that the audience is curious about what to do now. And so what I'd like to do with our final 10 minutes is invite each of you to spend 2 minutes on 2 things. The first is, per the title of this, what is a bold vision? I feel like we can get stuck in having to fight skirmishes when really it would be a benefit to business owners, to the public, to everybody, to have a kind of consistent, harmonious vision of the future that we could all subscribe to. So that's kind of, feel free to dream. I'm curious each of you would respond. The second is, pragmatically, if you're a business owner, if you're a citizen of the UK, what are tangible steps we can take today? And it doesn't need to be an exhaustive list. We're going to be in the speakers, meet the speakers afterwards if you guys want to come and meet everybody. Yeah, those are the 2 things I'd like you to respond with. You've got the clock there, so you know how much time we have. But Ravi, would you
Shall I
start?
start? Of course. I kind of touched on my aspirational data rights dream, as it were, is an idea of an international convention on data rights, because I think what you see is a data hierarchy and a data rights hierarchy, and it leads to the types of problems that Stephanie was just discussing. I think if you have data as an international concern that all states have an equal interest in protecting and controlling and empowering regulators to make sure data abuses don't occur en masse, make sure data use is minimized, data retention is minimized, allow free access, give holistic answers, then that would be really important, making sure there's an internationally convergent regime. In terms of pragmatic steps, I think it's written into the act, it's privacy by design. I think actually Michael might have a big part to have played in privacy by design. But the idea that you actually, when you're creating systems, only take as much data as you need to fulfill your objective. Make sure that you allow access and transparency and meaningful transparency. Make sure people understand how their data is being used, not just here's a terabyte of information and a bunch of code. Give people meaningful access. Make data subjects part of the discussion and make sure people can have a relationship with technology that they appreciate and feel empowered to assert their rights over.
Thank you. Michael?
A bold vision. I think in European law and governance, there's this idea, and whether it actually happens in practice or not is a question, called the subsidiarity principle, that law and governance should happen at the lowest possible proper level for that to happen, like the most local level, where you can get economies of scale and so on. And I think we need a subsidiarity principle for data. So data processing should happen at the lowest feasible level, so on your device, in your company, in your firm. And it's the only way which we can manage what Stephanie was talking about as huge high-risk centralized databases, to really have this discussion. Now, there's a problem with this. Bold vision problem. The problem is that not everyone is a super user. Right? So traditionally, this has been, hey, you can run your own server. Hey, you can you operate using Etherpad, not Google Docs. Hey, you can just host everything yourself, host your own email. Well, we saw how that went. But the challenge here is really that, no, you can't just host it yourself. That is not a realistic vision. So you need a combination of a subsidiarity principle with collective, societal, technical, and social support, where it enables people to do that and empowers them to have their control at the lowest possible level. But it also empowers them to say, act collectively against an organization. It doesn't stop all the problems. I can still make take it or leave it offers. If I'm Facebook, I can still say, sign up to my service or my deal, or you don't get it at all. Even if you process the data on your device, just be a gatekeeper and I won't let you in. So there's still problems that remain, but I think that would be a good start. And we're getting the technologies and we're getting the practices that allow us to do that today. And we need to put people in the training pipeline that know how that works.
Okay, and in 20 seconds, a pragmatic step we might be able to take today?
I think we should start, firstly, I think we should move away from things like blockchain and start talking about decentralized technologies and train people for decentralized technologies, train them to think in decentralized ways and understand how people in practice can deploy decentralized technologies even though they're a lay user, even though they don't have any experience there, how they can deploy it meaningfully and easily.
Great, thank you. Salome.
So real quick, and I sort of hinted on it, I guess bold vision for the future is having an environmental protection approach to data. I think that captures collective issues, common resource issues, huge public hazard issues, but at the same time empowers people to make individual decisions about how they can live like a healthy data life. Definitely signing on to some of Michael's vision. I'm a lawyer, so I'll pivot more to the practical stuff. I think a lot of what we're talking about, a very important necessary step, is this idea that your risk of an asset follows that asset around. And I know I'm previewing Keith on this because we work together. But this idea that if you're going to be using data for everything, but it's incredibly cheap and it's not at all risky for you to do, there are no incentives to do a lot of the other sort of best practices that we're talking about on this stage. So I think from a legal perspective, a necessary first pragmatic step is meaning that if you think of data as an asset, then the risks and the benefits of that asset need to travel together so that you're not having a horrible moral hazard issue in how this stuff is being deployed, used, and uncritically just run away with. And I think there are a number of ways to do that. You can see that in private law, you can see that in statutes, but at the core, that's sort of my pragmatic suggestion.
Thank you. Keith?
I think Stephanie.
I skipped you, maybe.
Yeah, and I'll come up with something new. Stephanie, I think, did a good job of highlighting the sort of danger of the momentum of the state in being able to do a lot with sort of the power that it has. And I think that I worry that we're starting to see echoes of that as we, at least in the States, begin to classify more and more fields as critical to national security. And so in my mind, I think part of the bold vision for the future is finding a way to sort of arrest some of that political momentum before it gets out of hand. And there's a sort of theory of social movements, right, which say that sort of movements are really this ongoing negotiation as people sort of figure out how to come up with common meanings for the same thing. And I think that that's sort of what we need to sort of start with here, is that we're not going to convince everybody to sort of care about this stuff as much as we do, but we need to help people kind of build informal understandings of the transactions that they're making, of the dangers of data, of things like that. And I think that in terms of a practical first step, you know, there's a real opportunity with GDPR, I think, that is in still embryonic stages of, like, this is an opportunity to explain what companies do with your data in plain language and in, like, interactive ways, as opposed to sort of a novella of legalese, right? I think I've gotten 30 or 35 of these emails. And so if we can, one, get a way to make that explanation coherent and understandable, and then two, for organizations who are making that explanation, if that can be something that is a competitive advantage, right? So I will go to the company that can explain what the heck they're doing with my data better. Then I think that we can start to build that progressive understanding in the long term.
Great, thank you. Stephanie?
I have two suggestions that I would love to see. The first is I'd like to see the strengthening of protection for whistleblowers. We saw under the Obama administration that was really tamped down, and I think that was a real mistake. I love the idea of strengthening regulators. I have yet to see where that really, it's too easy to defang a regulator. I want, in an ideal world, I want that to work, but I think that you have to be really practical about humans. Humans lie, they embezzle, they say that the diesel engines that they're building on cars pass emissions testing, and now I have asthma because I've lived in a city where those liars pumped toxins into the air, and now, like, all of London's kids are growing up breathing this stuff, right? Like, and they did that for money. Those were engineers who knew it. And you have to have whistleblowers who are willing to come forward and go, this is happening, right? Christopher Wiley with Cambridge Analytica on Facebook, this is happening. Even the protesters at Google on Project Maven, right? So we have to empower that, because whistleblowers really get punished, they hurt, and the research on whistleblowers and what happens to their lives afterwards is appalling. These people are often heroes, not saints, complicated people, but they are doing something that benefits society. So I would love to see democracies, at least, I don't hold out for the rest of the political spectrum, but I'd like to see democracies protect and indeed encourage whistleblowing far more than they do. And then the second is I would like to see journalists help shareholders and investors and the public understand which companies are building the surveillance apparatus. I would love to test all of you and ask who you think is building most of the biometric technology here in the United Kingdom. Do you know it? It's really boring companies. It's not the sexy, like, evil ones that you would necessarily think. It's the bog standard ones that are in most of your pension plans, right? And I'd love to be going to some of those investor meetings and being like, what's up with that? What are we doing with that? What's your position on that? What's your framework on that? And I guarantee you they'll all be like, you know, and get the lawyers in, and we'll get lots of mealy-mouthed statements. I want the journalists to put that stuff on steroids. I want it on the front page, and I want us all to know who's building it.
Cool. So to bring this to a close, again, everyone will be downstairs. Please come join us afterwards if you have questions that you want answered. I'm going to say three things to close this out. The first is that the ancient Greeks used to have engineers sleep under the bridges they built. You know, engineers have a lot of responsibility now because it's them that are often building these things and are having to think through the complexities of it. I think, in my own vision, we need to support them in making those ethical decisions. I've just proposed yesterday a panel at NIPS, which is the major AI conference, on this very topic. So things are happening. But the second thing is to you, and come address this with the group afterwards, we need to think through what has to happen now in this window of time. The reason I mentioned Central Park at that moment is because it was when the infrastructure was nascent enough that values could be instilled in the actual place that this infrastructure was going to come up. And there's valuable lessons, I think, that we can draw from history. For example, to carve out that 800-acre swath of land, 1,700 families had to be displaced. So when we think of the kind of who's losing out currently, we need to think of whose interests we have to protect, because it may be that we find ourselves in that situation, that if you apply for a job and there's an algorithm between you and the HR person that actually gives you that job, this starts to matter for you. If you apply for a mortgage, if you vote, the ways in which this will manifest in our lives are there are numerous ways, and so we need to think of collectively how can we respond to this. Last thing I'll say is something we've talked about on email that I hope we can do is to have some sort of output from this session of like a one-page document to summarize the key principles. If that's of interest to you, please find us on Twitter. I don't know if it's possible to put the slide up a moment ago with everybody's Twitter handles on there, but keep up, because I hope that's something we could output from this to share. And thank you again for your time. I enjoyed this very much.